San Diegans accomplish great things every day. We care about our neighbors and our community. We are proud of our diversity. We are resilient. We hold our leaders accountable. We live in one of the most dynamic cities in America, the San Diego Union-Tribune, telling San Diego's story for more than 150 years.
Hello, I'm Dr. Gail F. Baker, Vice President and Provost at the University of San Diego.
And I'm Dr. Noelle Norton, Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences here at USD.
For the second year in a row, USD, along with its College of Arts and Sciences and Humanities Center, is proud to return as the presenting sponsor for the 2021 San Diego Union-Tribune Festival of Books.
As a university deeply committed to the liberal arts, USD promotes a form of lifelong learning that ignites curiosity, builds critical connections across different ideas and topics by seeing them from unique perspectives.
Our partnership with the Festival of Books enables all of us avid readers to come together as a community alongside renowned authors from all over the world and to dive deeply into imaginative stories and important themes.
Yes, books do have the ability to open minds and hearts. On behalf of the University of San Diego, we thank you for joining us for today's program to explore the world of books with us.
Enjoy the presentation.
Welcome everybody to the San Diego Union-Tribune Festival of Books, virtual edition. My name is Seth Marko. I'm from the Book Catapult. We're an independent bookstore here in San Diego. I'm very excited today to be talking with two authors about their debut novels. Daniel Loedel is the author of Hades, Argentina, and Kawai Washburn, author of Sharks and the Time of Saviors. Welcome, gentlemen. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
You know, the kind of cool thing about these virtual events is that we, you know, Kawai, I think you're in Minneapolis, right now? And yep. Daniel is in New York, and I'm in San Diego, and we're just like rapping about books in the middle of the day. It's great. So I do really appreciate that the Union-Tribune, this is the second year that we've done a virtual version of the festival. I really appreciate that they recognize the value of still putting together panels like this and allowing us to still have conversations about books, even though we're all really far away. It's very, very cool. You know, I kind of wanted to ask you both because it is your first book, both of you. I mean, Daniel, you've been in the book industry for quite a while as an editor. But it's your first novel, and is this how you imagine your your first book tour going, or the rollout of your first book?
Definitely not. But I, as you were saying, I sort of have learned to appreciate a lot of aspects of the virtual tour and stuff like that. I mean, you know, my novel is set in Argentina, and I have a lot of family in South America, and so they were able to watch events, which is not something that could have ever happened before. Someone tuned in from Spain in like the middle of the night for one. So I've actually come to really, I don't know, to be grateful for it is a little strong. You know, I mean, something about interacting with people like you in person that would have been really great and special. I think that kind of one-on-one human, right. But it's still been nice, and I've still managed to celebrate it.
Good. And Kawai, I mean, your book, Daniel, yours came out in January this year, so you were kind of at the tail end of a lot of the really terrible pandemic stuff. But Kawai, your book came out in April of last year, So you were able to do some pre-pub stuff, but I mean, you were scheduled to come to the Book Catapult last April. We had to cancel it because the world fell apart.
It actually came out in March. The book came out in the first week of March. So it was right when everything started getting locked down and when stuff got really serious. I think at the time that the book first hit bookshelves, everybody was mostly paying attention to Seattle here in the United States as far as the outbreak was concerned. But within that next week or so, I think right around then, if I recall correctly, was when the NBA shut down or something right around then. And I feel like one of those events when a major organization had shut something down, everybody was like, oh, this is really serious. And I think within another week or so, we started seeing the case counts rise dramatically in New York City. And then I think everything else is just sort of history from there. So I did one live event that first week of March. I think it was March 2nd or something. That was here at a local bookstore, and that's the only thing I ever did live. And a bunch of stuff got canceled. A whole lot of stuff just disappeared because at that point in time, nobody really we hadn't really set up nearly as much virtual conference, virtual event abilities as we have now. So at the time, there's a bunch of stuff that just got canceled. So
yeah,
I didn't want to talk about my book either. I didn't really feel like talking about my book because everybody was just paralyzed by what was happening. So for quite a while, and I think for that entire summer, because it was here in Minneapolis, and this is the place where George Floyd was murdered, everything associated with that and the civil unrest that came about here in the Twin Cities as a result of that, all of that just happened. It's just one long blur. I don't think until the end of the year, I'd really gotten to a place where I felt like I wanted to talk about my book at all, but I still had to try and put together events and do stuff in the middle of all that, which was really hard.
Yeah, not an easy year for anybody. I mean, but yeah, I canceled our event with you. I mean, I think you and I talked about doing it virtually at some point, and I just did not have the bandwidth to do any events like that. So we at our store didn't do anything virtual for a long time.
Oh, sorry. I'm assuming you were 24/7 just filing orders online.
It was like I was at the store 7 days a week. Yeah, just shipping and doing deliveries, and yeah, it was terrible but great, at the same time. So, so as a bookseller, I'm often, pretty much all day long, I spend giving elevator pitches on people's books, both of your books. But I always like to hear the authors give me their elevator pitch. So Daniel, give me your pitch. Give me your 10-second Hades, Argentina.
Is on. Well, this will be my opportunity to show the book.
There you go.
And I'll say, it's about a guy named Tomás Orilla who returns to Buenos Aires in 1986, 10 years after he fled at the height of the military dictatorship. And when he goes back, it's to search essentially for the woman he was in love with at the time, who was disappeared. And that search takes him into essentially an underworld of ghosts, where he basically tries to find her ghost, hence the title Hades, Argentina. And this Hades is not, hellfire and brimstone. It's basically the memories of his time in 1976 when the dictatorship began. And so he has to sort of, at the same time that he's seeking out the woman he loves, sort of confront what he did at that time. And it's sort of inspired by my family history. My half-sister was disappeared in Argentina during the dictatorship. So that was the germ of the story.
Right. Kawai, give me your pitch.
Yeah, so Sharks in the Time of Saviors. By the way, I hate this question, Seth, because I never get any better at it. I've done it over and over and over, and I never get any better at it.
It's hard to do, right? I mean, this is like you're a bookseller for 30 seconds. Go.
So bad. I'm so bad at it. But it's a story of a blue-collar family in Hawaii, and it follows the sort of arc of their lives over about 20 years, starting in 1994 with the collapse of the sugarcane industry on the Big Island of Hawaii. And the family, in the aftermath of that and the economic fallout that they see in their community, they're actually witness to a miracle when the youngest son of the family is saved from drowning by sharks. And the family takes this as a sign from ancient Hawaiian gods that not only the child, but the family itself is sort of marked for bigger and better things, and that they have some level of divine intervention in their lives. As the book goes on, we start to see that youngest son develop some really hard to understand abilities, and the book becomes really a story about how the entire family comes to understand what those abilities mean, and ultimately what that does to what the family becomes. So I think that's probably the easiest way I can talk about it. There's a bunch of other stuff in there, but
That's pretty good. That's pretty good. So I was thinking about how to connect your two books together for purposes of conversation, because you kind of have to do that, right, as the moderator here. But I think what really connects them in a way is that sort of magical realism element. You both use it in very, very different ways, I think. But there's a mix of folklore or magic or mythology into these kind of contemporary storylines without sort of pigeonholing your story into like a particular genre. Can either of you, maybe Daniel, you can answer first. Can you imagine writing this particular story without having that? I think it would be almost grounded too much in reality if you just told that story of people being disappeared in this kind of awful scene in Argentina without having the kind of balance of it being this underworld journey. Can you imagine telling this story without that?
Well, it's kind of funny you asked that, because I tried at first. I tried to write a purely realist version of this novel for a while, just sort of focusing on Tomas in 1976 and his experience. And I just could not do it for a variety of reasons. I think it was difficult to wade into those horrible historical realities directly. I think it also wasn't necessarily as true to my emotional experience. The phrasing magical realism can be somewhat odd to me, because it implies that the magical element is the unrealistic element. But in some ways, I grew up with a sister I never met. She was kind of like a ghost in my life. She wasn't really talked about, but you could kind of feel her presence emotionally on my father, on my half brother, and when I started to look into her, it was essentially that, searching for a ghost. It was trying to grapple with her loss in that way. So when I sort of stumbled on the idea of Hades to tell this story of the search for a ghost and wading through the world of ghosts, that felt much truer to me. I suddenly felt like I could do the interactions, I could tell the emotional story with a lot more ease and certainty and authority. So in a weird way, my answer is almost, it felt more, I don't know if real, it felt truer to me to do it this way. And that I learned that the hard way after many, many moons of trying to do it without ghosts.
I don't like that magical realism title either, but it is that. But I can't really picture it without it, and I think it would be almost too heavy. As heavy as it is, I don't know that it would. I think it would be heavier if you didn't have that element. There's something about it, like Tomas not actually experiencing all these things again. He's like, through his own memories, as painful as that is, it's not as painful as it was when it was happening, maybe. So thank you for that, I guess. I don't know. And Kawai, I really don't know what, your story is very much about this family and the bonds of that family, but also I can't really picture it without the sort of the old folklore, the old gods of Hawaii. It's a really driving core point.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think part of that is because when I started writing the story, I knew that one of the things I wanted to write about was colonialism and the history of that in the islands, and how that had affected my own experiences in the continental United States, what people from the islands refer to as the mainland. There were a lot of things about coming to the mainland that it took me a long time to understand, and one of the things that I consider a gift of having grown up in the islands is that I had a very different understanding of the history of the United States than I think a lot of people do, because the islands were once a sovereign kingdom, right? Hawaii was once a sovereign kingdom, and it was stolen from the monarchy and from the people of the islands by the United States. And so I knew that when I was going to write about this, like, because I didn't know if I would ever write another story. And so I knew that writing about the islands, one of the things that I always just sort of carry with me from having grown up there is this colonial reference, right? And a very much an anti-colonial, like, just bent. That's just the way I approach, when I think about relationships between countries and things like that, or history. There's always a part of me that really fights furiously against colonialism. And so I knew that the book would have those elements in it. And if it is going to have those elements in it, then one of the things that I think is really powerful about anti-colonialism, about the islands, the culture of the islands, is a lot of the mythologies and beliefs of the islands, and the way that those are, all the other aspects of the culture are suffused with those things, and you can't separate one from the other. And even when you talk about the title, magical realism, I guess it depends whose reality, right? I guess that's always my question, is like, when you say realism, whose reality are you talking about? Are you talking about a sort of Western Christian, Eurocentric reality that considers there to be a separation between this world and the other world, or between man and nature, or those things? Because that's not my experience of the culture of the islands. And so for me, magical realism, I'm like, that's great if you want to call it that, but to the people of the islands and to lots of people in different countries, the idea of magic and reality as being these two separate things that doesn't exist. There is no separation like that. And so that was another thing that having this mythology come to life, to me, is just the truest expression I could find for what it feels like to live in the islands and be from the islands and have my worldview informed by that. So yeah, I don't think it would have been possible to write this story without those elements being front and center and driving the plot and the narrative as they do.
I mean, was there anything that didn't make the cut that might have been, I always wonder, like, is there with these, and I don't know what else do you call it other than magical realism? It's just a literature term, but I mean, was there anything that was like deemed, I mean, I know your editor, Kawai, so I know that Sean probably just allows anything in there, but was there anything that was maybe not, asking the reader to suspend their disbelief about certain things, a mainlander, was there anything that didn't make the cut in that way? Does that make sense? I mean,
I think so. I can't think of any major elements with regards to the sort of the cultural touch points related to, mythology, and if we want to refer to it as magic, or whatever we're going to call it for the purposes of this discussion. There aren't any major elements I can think of related to that. There were some sections where there was maybe a slightly slower development of some of the experiences that happened to Kawai in particular later in the novel, as well as some of the things we come to learn about Augie, the father of the family. Some of those things kind of came out in a slightly slower trickle, where there were a few additional events that occurred that sort of built towards what ends up happening towards the tail end of the novel. So those things got kind of compressed. But besides that, I can't think of anything major, from that perspective that was chopped from the book.
Yeah. I mean, Daniel, was there anything, I mean, yours was, in a similar way. I mean, was there anything that was, I mean, I also, this kind of leads into the question of, like, an editor editing your book, it's got to feel kind of weird. But was there anything that didn't make the cut in that way, and that kind of magical realism?
No, I would say I will say though that in edits, a lot of early edits were, in some ways, even before I started working with an editor, when I was just working with an agent, were about sort of blurring the lines between magic and reality. Like, the more I could make it unclear in some ways which side of that line we were on, the more effective both were. So it wasn't that I necessarily cut anything, but I made either more subtle or more blurred some of the magic worked. And yeah, in terms of being an editor myself, it actually wasn't weird. It was a joy. I think I'd like to think, I don't know if my editor would agree, but that I entered it sort of a little less precious maybe than I might have otherwise. Having told many authors to rewrite a lot of things, when my editor told me to rewrite certain things, I was not really in a position to be like, what about my art? Really okay, yeah, you're probably right. And yeah, no, it was really great. I learned a lot from my editor, both as a writer and as an editor too. She's a great editor.
Right. If say you're as an editor, you're handed the manuscript for Sharks in the Time of Saviors, and spoiler alert for anybody out there who hasn't read it, the main character, arguably the main character, is killed off in the middle of the book. What do you do? Did you let him do it?
I love that, but I think I don't know. I think it's a beautifully edited book. I remember. Well, I don't want to get too in the weeds of this, but I didn't have it on submission. I was jealous of the editor at Scribner, where I worked at the time, who did. I'll just put it that way. I don't know. I think a good editor always tries to keep the bones intact like that, and it's more about like the flesh, the skin, the other things than like such deep points.
Right. I also think that in some ways both books are certainly novels about love. I mean, maybe not in a kind of traditional love story love, but also guilt. And I just kind of wanted to touch on that. I don't really know how to, and in very different ways. I think, Daniel, your book is certainly, Tomas has he feels intense guilt over what he did, what happened to Isabel. But his love for her is what kind of drives this story along this whole time. And in Kawai, it's different in that way, in that it's the familial love of this family that kind of binds them all together, but also their love for Hawaii and everything that means to them. But the guilt that I think that like Noah feels throughout the book, throughout his life, is pretty intense, and in a different kind of intensity, maybe to Daniel's book. But yeah, I don't know. Those are like two really, I feel like really strong kind of driving elements to both books. I don't know if either of you want to speak to that. I don't know how you. I'm not a moderator. I'm a bookseller and a reader, and I end up talking about the books more than asking questions.
I can take it and like pose a sort of hypothetical connection here, which is to go back to what you were saying about colonialism, and I do, or at least I've wondered. I grew up in the sort of the shadow of a lot of guilt. My father felt guilty for what had happened, I think just because he could not save his daughter. But I think there's a certain guilt of both. I think there's a guilt that comes with escape of a certain kind, whether that's about fleeing where you come from. So my family, is not in Argentina anymore. There's the guilt of survival, of just and I guess what I'm trying to say is I wonder, when like your country or your homeland is sort of traumatized in this way, if by enduring you are sort of, you end up with a kind of internalized guilt that may link. If I'm reaching, let me know. But that may link sort of the threads of guilt in both our novels. I don't know. I certainly feel that was part of what fueled the guilt in me. Something like that.
Yeah, I think that the guilt that you're referring to that's in my book, or at least from my perspective, because I'm just one person in terms of experiencing the book, and readers are going to have entirely different and totally valid reactions as well. But for me, when I think of the guilt that you're speaking of, particularly with Nainoa, it feels like it's more of a sense of debt, right? And you sort of have this burden, or you have this feeling of a debt that is owed by your circumstance. So if you're in a situation in which you've leaped beyond the boundaries of what it felt like your family was capable of. We could talk about this like socioeconomically, for instance, right? If you suddenly find yourself in a higher socioeconomic class, or you've kind of made it out of the confines of a space that otherwise, limit people's opportunities and their just ability to live a full and rich life. If you're somebody that, again, if you escape from that, or you kind of transcend those boundaries, then there's a sense of well, how do I get as many people as I can with me? Or like, everybody has to come along with me, right? If I'm up here and everybody else is down here, like that's wrong. It's just, inequality is wrong. I have to figure out some way to rectify that situation, right? And so I think for Nainoa, I think he feels very deeply, he's having to struggle with those questions where he has what appear to be, these set of abilities and things that make him remarkable and significant. His family continues to tell him this and spend time, trying to help him become something bigger than himself. And so I think for him, there's this huge burden of wanting to figure out what the full realization of himself is supposed to be, and what the implications of that are for his family and for the islands as well. And so it's a kind of guilt. It feels more like a debt than a guilt, but I guess guilt is almost a form of debt in some way. So.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think I hesitated to call it guilt with Nainoa, but it is though. I mean, he feels like throughout his life feels like he should be doing more to help more people, and it's just not possible. That's not his story, and Tomas is in Hades, Argentina is such an intense guilt, and I had a feeling it was based in reality, Daniel. I mean, like you said, talking about your father, that's the kind of thing that I can't wrap my head around. So I guess maybe thank you for writing that story, because
well, I don't know that I can wrap my head around it either. I think the book is an attempt to wrap my head around various things that are probably out of grasp.
Right.
I remember the author of Night. I'm going to mispronounce his name. It's Elie. I think it's Wiesel or Wiesel that wrote Night. He talked about that. I've definitely read some interviews with him years ago where he had just said the survivor's guilt was overwhelming. And then he was also like, well, some of us that survived, we weren't like good people. Like surviving that situation, sometimes you weren't a good person to survive it, right? Like you survived it, but some of the things you had done, you might be ashamed of or feel incredibly guilty about. And so you're alive, and maybe in some situations there were selfish choices you made, and there's like incredible amount of guilt that comes with that. It just feels like one of those things that is never. You have a set of bad choices in front of you in a bad situation that's forced on you by external forces, and it's impossible to necessarily give yourself as much credit to just be like, I was in a compromised situation and I survived it, and that's not good or bad. It's just what happened, and none of it has to do with me necessarily, right? I think that's really hard as a human to do if you have any level of empathy anyway. I don't know, maybe like a narcissist or somebody with other problems could survive that and be like, cool, that was totally fine. But all the rest of us would probably struggle with that for the rest of our lives. So.
Yeah, I mean, right, Tomas, that is, he's in a situation that there's no other way out of it for himself. And I think the thing that's so hard about it is that that's a story that's a true story. That happened to people, a lot of people. I mean, not just Argentina, but I mean, like Elie Wiesel. Like, there you go. I mean, it's who knows how you get out of the situations that you're in when it's like the worst of humanity.
Well, it sort of connects. What I was thinking when I connected his guilt to Noah's, in a sense, is when you're given any kind of gift, whether it's the gift of survival or of power or of certain abilities, it's sort of, I feel like you have to ask yourself why you, right, on some level. And I think with survivors, that's definitely true. But if people who just get lucky by escaping their economic class, it's the same thing. It's like, why me and not my next door neighbor? Again, I think there are certain narcissists who would not question themselves that way, but I think that question is really raw and true to many of us.
Yeah, and we're running towards the end of I can't believe we're at the end of 30 minutes already, but I do always I hate asking the question of like what your like literary influences are, but I do like the answer usually. Not necessarily your influences, but like what you're reading now, or maybe what you're reading while you were writing these books. Because I'm a bookseller, I have, two books that came to mind while you guys were talking. Kawai, you were talking about the anti-colonialism, and there's a great nonfiction book called How to Hide an Empire by Daniel Immerwahr. If you haven't read that, and I believe it touches a little bit on Hawaii, but it does. It's about how, the United States has kind of spread their tendrils around the globe in very, very small ways, but having these like giant repercussions over time. But fascinating if you haven't read that. And for Daniel, Daniel's book is Yuri Herrera wrote a book called Signs Preceding the End of the World. Have you read that, or do you know about that book?
I have not, but I do know about it.
And so this one reminds me quite a bit of yours in that it's a border story. So it's a woman coming from Mexico into the United States to find her brother, but it's a novel. But there's a whole underworld element, and it's like it really brings to like the Aztec mythology is a huge part of it, but in very subtle, kind of strange ways. But it really reminded me of your underworld in a lot of ways.
Now I feel guilty that going back to the book that I haven't read it, but
come on, it's like I said, I can't help even, I started by asking you guys what your influences are, and then I told you about 2 books that you need to read. So either Daniel, do you have any?
I'll name a couple rapidly. That Remains of the Day was one big one. It's, to me, like that's the key book on guilt. And then Exit West by Mohsen Hamid was one that sort of blends magic and reality, touch on sort of very real political issues. And the last I would mention similarly does that is Jesmond Ward's Sing Unburied Sing, which is, just glorious in every way.
Goodbye. What about you?
We got like 5 seconds, man.
Yeah, we're fine. We can go over a little bit. That's fine.
So let me see. So the novel took me 10 years to write. So I read so many different books over the course of it. Just a few that popped into my head right now are Constellation of Vital Phenomena by Anthony Mara, and the short story collection, All the Names They Used for God. I think I'm getting that right. I'm getting it close to right. It's Anjali. I'm probably mispronouncing her name, for which I apologize, but I think it's like Anjali Sakdeva or something like that. I'm sorry if I'm getting that wrong. But All the Names They Used for God. I read a lot of poetry. There's a collection by Tracy K. Smith, or an anthology that was, I think it was Poems for Our Times. It's a bunch of poems. It's a collection of poets that she put together. And I guess I could go on, but those are a couple off the top of my head. I try to get different ones from poetry, short story collections, novels, because I read really widely. So cool. I got influences from all over the place.
Thank you, both of you. Kawai Strong Washburn, author of Sharks in the Time of Saviors, Daniel Loedel, Hades, Argentina. I really appreciate you guys taking the time to just talk to me, but also to do this festival. We're all literarily, San Diego is better for it when you guys are taking the time like this. So I really appreciate it. So thank you. So there's a pretty strong community of bookstores here in town, and we do help put the festival together, other than just being here like this. So if you'd like to support local bookshops, you can by purchasing either one of these great novels. You can do so at bookshop.org. And it helps all the local bookstores. The address for that is below. Also, please consider supporting the San Diego Council on Literacy, who's also a big supporter of the festival. literacysandiego.org. Support literacy for all. Full slate of programming for the Festival of Books continues online at sdfestivalbooks.com. All the videos for all conversations like this, and will be available for you to check out anytime. Thank you, everybody out there listening to us blather on for half an hour. Me at least. I really appreciate you all being there, even though I can't see you. Again, I'm Seth Marko from the Book Catapult, and thank you, everybody, for for checking this out.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.